The old courthouse stood tall against the morning sky, its brick walls having witnessed thousands of lives forever changed within its chambers. The wooden benches in Courtroom 3 were filled with anxious families, stern-faced attorneys, and curious onlookers as Judge Eleanor Hayes entered. Everyone rose to their feet. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Hayes," announced the bailiff, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Judge Hayes moved with purpose to her seat, her black robe flowing behind her. At 58, with strands of silver weaving through her dark hair, pulled back in a tight bun, she commanded respect with just a glance. For 15 years, she'd sat behind this same bench, and folks around town knew her as the Hammer, fair but firm, with little patience for excuses. "Be seated," she said, adjusting her reading glasses as she opened the first file of the day. The morning crawled by with the usual cases: traffic violations, petty theft, a drunk and disorderly. Judge Hayes handled each with brisk efficiency, but gavel punctuating the end of each case like a period at the end of a sentence. By midday, the wooden benches had mostly emptied and the lunch hour approached. "Next case," she called, not looking up as she reached for another folder. "The State versus Timothy Walker," announced the court clerk. Judge Hayes flipped open the folder and scanned the contents. Breaking and entering at Wilson's Electronics on Maple Street. No items stolen, but significant property damage. Her eyes narrowed as she saw the age, 17. Just another troubled kid headed down a bad path. The side door opened, and the bailiff led in a young black teen. He wasn't what she expected. Skinny, almost fragile-looking in his oversized button-up shirt that someone had clearly loaned him for court. His shoulders curled inward, as if trying to make himself invisible, and his eyes remained fixed on the floor as he shuffled to the defendant's table. Judge Hayes had seen that walk hundreds of times, the walk of someone who'd already given up, who expected the worst, because that's what life had trained them to expect. "Timothy Walker," she said, her voice carrying across the now quiet courtroom. "You're charged with breaking and entering. How do you plead?" The public defender, a tired-looking woman with a stack of files nearly as tall as her coffee cup, leaned over and whispered something to the boy. He nodded slightly. "Not guilty, Your Honor," the lawyer answered for him. Judge Hayes sighed inwardly. Another case, another troubled teen. She'd seen this story play out so many times she could practically recite the script from memory. The prosecutor would paint the picture of a budding criminal. The defense would talk about a good kid who made one mistake. And she would have to decide what to do with yet another young life teetering on the edge. "Prosecution, present your case," she said, leaning back in her chair. As the district attorney stood up, Judge Hayes studied the boy more carefully. There was something in his posture, not just fear or resignation, but something else she couldn't quite name. Something that made her think this case might be different from the hundreds before it. Little did she know, in just a few minutes, this ordinary Tuesday in court would become one she'd remember for the rest of her career. All because of 2 words this quiet boy would speak that would cut through 15 years of her judicial armor and reach a part of herself she'd almost forgotten existed. The small house on Elm Street where Timothy Walker grew up had peeling paint and worn steps, but his mother kept the inside spotless. Pine Ridge wasn't the kind of neighborhood that showed up in city tourism brochures. It was the kind of place where people worked hard, worried about bills, and hoped their kids would find a way out someday. Timothy's mother, Denise, hadn't always worked 2 jobs. Before his father went to prison, she'd been able to stay home most afternoons when Timothy got back from school. They would sit at their scratched kitchen table, and she would help him with homework, while something simple but filling simmered on the stove. Those were good days, warm days, days when Timothy's smile came easy and often. Everything changed when he was 7. He still remembered the police lights flashing through his bedroom window, the shouting and his mother's crying. His father had been at the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in a robbery he hadn't planned, but couldn't prove he didn't know about. 20 years, the judge had said. 20 years for being in a car with people carrying stolen goods. After that, Denise took on a second job cleaning office buildings at night. Timothy's grandmother would come over to watch him, falling asleep in the armchair while the TV played softly in the background. He would carefully place a blanket over her before putting himself to bed, trying his best to be the man of the house even at 8 years old. Despite everything, Timothy did well in school. His teachers often told Denise what a bright boy she had, how he had a natural way with numbers and science. His fifth-grade teacher even bought him extra books about space after discovering his fascination with astronomy. Timothy would spend hours on the apartment roof, staring up at the stars, imagining worlds far beyond Pine Ridge. Middle school was harder. The other kids started noticing his faded clothes, the free lunches, the fact that he never had the right shoes or video games. Still, he kept his head down and his grades up. His mother's proud smile when she looked at his report card made it all worth it. High school started the same way. Timothy joined the science club and even won a district competition with his project on solar energy. The prize was $50 and a certificate, which his mother framed and hung in their living room, right next to the family's only photo of his father. But halfway through his sophomore year, things began to fall apart. Denise got sick, nothing serious. The doctor said just exhaustion and high blood pressure from working 60-hour weeks for years on end. But she had to cut back her hours, and the bills started piling up. The electricity got shut off twice that winter. Timothy started skipping lunch to save his lunch money for helping at home. That's when he met Ray and his friends. They were older, already out of school, with cars and cash, and an easiness about them that Timothy envied. Ray's cousin worked at the corner store and would slip them snacks for free. They had a way of making everything seem like a game, even the small thefts they pulled off around town. Everyone does it, Ray told him one day, pocketing a candy bar without paying. Stores build it into their prices anyway. Timothy knew better, but the line between right and wrong gets blurry when you're hungry, when your mother falls asleep crying about bills, when the future you once dreamed about seems to drift further away each day. The night it all went wrong wasn't supposed to be anything big. Ray had told him that Wilson's Electronics left their back door unlocked sometimes. They were just going to look around, maybe take something small that wouldn't be missed. But the alarm went off, Ray and the others ran, and Timothy froze, deer in the headlights, as the saying goes. By the time the police arrived, he was the only one still there, standing in the dark among shelves of things he could never afford. The state calls Officer Michael Thompson. The uniformed police officer made his way to the witness stand. He was young, maybe only a few years into the job, with a fresh haircut and a serious expression that seemed practiced in front of a mirror. Officer Thompson, please tell the court what you found on the night of April 17th at Wilson's Electronics, said Assistant District Attorney William Porter, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a navy blue suit that looked expensive even from across the room. Timothy watched from his seat as the officer described arriving at the store after the alarm went off, finding the back door ajar, and discovering Timothy inside. The suspect was standing in the computer section, appearing dazed. He made no attempt to flee when I entered. Porter paced slowly in front of the witness stand, his leather shoes clicking against the floor tiles. And was anything stolen from the premises? No, sir. Nothing appeared to be missing, but a display case had been broken and several items were out of place. Timothy's public defender, Mrs. Chen, scribbled notes on her yellow legal pad. She hadn't had much time to talk with him before the hearing, just 15 rushed minutes in a small consultation room that smelled like lemon cleaner and old coffee. She'd explained that she had 23 other cases that day and would do her best for him. After Officer Thompson stepped down, Porter called the store manager, who testified about the $800 in damage to the display case and the lost business while they cleaned up. Then came the school counselor, who spoke in a regretful tone about Timothy's concerning decline over the past year. He used to be one of our promising students, especially in science. But his attendance has become spotty, his grades have dropped, and he's been caught sleeping in class several times. Timothy looked down at his hands. He'd been sleeping in class because he was working nights at a warehouse whenever they'd call him in for shifts. The under-the-table cash helped keep the lights on at home. But he couldn't say that without getting the warehouse in trouble for hiring a minor. Porter approached the bench with a folder. Your Honor, I'd also like to submit Timothy Walker's disciplinary record. He handed copies to Judge Hayes and Mrs. Chen. As you can see, there have been 3 incidents of fighting, multiple tardies, and 1 previous incident of suspected theft from another student, though charges were never filed. The fights had been because some boys wouldn't stop talking about his father being in prison. The theft had been a misunderstanding about a borrowed textbook. But none of that mattered now, as Porter continued building his case. Furthermore, Porter said, turning to face the small audience in the courtroom, "We have reason to believe the defendant has been associating with Raymond Carter and his group." He paused to let the name sink in. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to recognize it. Judge Hayes' eyebrows raised slightly. Timothy felt his stomach twist. Ray's record was much worse than his, with drug charges and assault. It was true they hung out sometimes, but Timothy hadn't known about all that when they first became friends. Porter's voice grew firmer as he approached his conclusion. "Your Honor, while no items were stolen that night, the intent was clear. Breaking and entering is a serious offense, regardless of where the theft was completed. And this pattern of behavior, declining school performance, troubling associations, previous discipline issues, suggests that without serious intervention, Mr. Walcott is on a path toward more serious criminal activity." He straightened his tie and looked directly at Judge Hayes. "The state recommends a 1-year sentence at the Greenwood Juvenile Detention Center. We believe this will provide both appropriate punishment and the structure this young man clearly needs." His voice softened almost sympathetically. "Sometimes, Your Honor, the kindest thing we can do for these kids is to show them early that actions have serious consequences." Judge Hayes nodded, her face unreadable as she made notes. Timothy felt cold all over. A year. A whole year locked up. His mother wouldn't survive without his help. And everyone knew what happened to kids who went to Greenwood. They rarely came out better than they went in. Mrs. Chen patted his arm gently, but her eyes told him not to get his hopes up. "Does the defense have anything to add before I make my ruling?" Judge Hayes asked, looking at Mrs. Chen over the top of her reading glasses. Mrs. Chen stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe the defendant would like to speak on his own behalf." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Timothy himself looked surprised, as if this hadn't been part of their plan. Judge Hayes checked her watch with a barely concealed sigh. She'd heard it all before, the apologies, the promises to do better, the tears. Part of her had already made up her mind. "Very well," she said, her voice carrying that practiced tone of patience wearing thin. "Mr. Walker, you may address the court." Timothy stood slowly, his borrowed shirt hanging loosely from his thin frame. Someone, his mother, probably, had made sure he looked presentable today. His hair was neatly trimmed, and his shirt, though clearly second-hand, was clean and pressed. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice so quiet that Judge Hayes had to lean forward slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I know what I did was wrong. I shouldn't have been in that store." The judge nodded, pen poised over her notepad, ready to jot down the usual lines before delivering her sentence. "I've never been in trouble with the law before," Timothy continued, his voice growing steadier. "I used to love school, especially science class." Judge Hayes's pen scratched against the paper as she made notes. "Standard stuff so far." "My mom works really hard, and I try to help her," Timothy said. "After my dad went away, things got tough." More notes, the family hardship angle, the absent father. She'd heard variations of this story hundreds of times in her 15 years on the bench. Timothy took a deep breath. "Before all this happened, I was actually doing pretty good. 2 years ago, our science class took a field trip." Judge Hayes glanced up. This was an odd turn for a pre-sentencing statement. "We went to this program called Camp Horizon," Timothy said. Judge Hayes's pen froze mid-word. Her eyes snapped up to meet Timothy's for the first time. "Camp Horizon?" she repeated, surprised to hear her own voice. Timothy nodded, a flicker of hope crossing his face at her reaction. "Yes, ma'am. Camp Horizon. It was this program for kids like me. I mean kids who could use some extra help finding their way." The courtroom seemed to fade around Judge Hayes as 30-year-old memories flooded back. Her law school summers volunteering at that camp in the mountains. The campfires, the mentoring sessions, the teenagers who arrived with scowls and left with purpose. It had been one of the most meaningful experiences of her life before the pressures of her career pushed those memories aside. "Go on," she said, her tone noticeably softer. "There was this man who came to talk to us," Timothy continued. "He said he used to be a troublemaker when he was young. Got caught stealing from a corner store. But instead of sending him to juvie, the judge sent him to Camp Horizon. And there was this law student there who believed in him, told him he was smart, helped him apply for college. Judge Hayes felt a strange tightness in her chest. She had a sudden image of a lanky teenager with bright eyes and a quick mind who'd been caught shoplifting but showed such promise. "That man was my Uncle Leon," Timothy said. "He's the reason I got interested in science. He told me all about that law student who changed his life. How she was tough but fair. How she didn't give up on kids everyone else had written off." The pen slipped from Judge Hayes's fingers, clattering on the wooden bench before rolling to the floor. No one moved to pick it up. The entire courtroom had gone still, watching this unexpected exchange unfold. "Your uncle," Judge Hayes said, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Leon Williams." Timothy's eyes widened. "Yes, ma'am. How did you know?" For the first time in years, Judge Eleanor Hayes was speechless in her own courtroom. For a moment, no one in the courtroom moved. The silence hung in the air, thick and unexpected. The prosecutor, Mr. Porter, looked back and forth between the judge and Timothy, trying to figure out what was happening. "Your Honor," he finally said, "is everything all right?" Judge Hayes seemed to snap back to the present. She straightened in her chair and looked at Timothy with new eyes, not as case number 47B on today's docket, but as a flesh and blood person with connections to her own life. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice softer than anyone in the courtroom had ever heard it, "how is your uncle these days?" Timothy blinked in surprise. "He's good, ma'am. He works at the community center on West Side now. Runs programs for kids and stuff." He paused, then added, "Wait, do you actually know him?" A small smile tugged at the corner of Judge Hayes' mouth, perhaps the first smile seen in her courtroom in months. "I believe I do. Leon Williams. Tall, gap between his front teeth, laughs with his whole body." Timothy's jaw dropped. "That's him. That's exactly him. But how?" "I'd like to call a 15-minute recess," Judge Hayes announced, cutting him off. She banged her gavel before anyone could object and disappeared through the door behind her bench. In her chambers, Judge Hayes sat at her desk with shaking hands. She pulled open the bottom drawer, where she kept a photo album she hadn't looked at in years. Flipping through the yellowed pages, she found what she was looking for. A group photo from the summer of '93 at Camp Horizon. There she was, 28 years old, with her long hair and determined smile, surrounded by a dozen teenagers in matching green t-shirts. And there, grinning widely with that unmistakable gap between his teeth, was Leon Williams. She had been a second-year law student then, spending her summer volunteering at a program for at-risk youth. Leon had been caught shoplifting from a convenience store, his second offense. The judge gave him a choice: juvenile detention or Camp Horizon. He chose the camp. At first he was quiet, sullen, keeping to himself during activities. But Judge Hayes, Eleanor back then, noticed how he lit up during science demonstrations. She started bringing him books about astronomy and physics, sitting with him during free periods to talk about black holes and distant planets. By the end of that summer, Leon had helped younger kids with their projects, earned the highest marks in the camp's makeshift classroom, and decided he wanted to go to college, the first in his family to do so. Elena had helped him fill out applications and study for entrance exams. And now, 3 decades later, his nephew was standing in her courtroom, his future in her hands. Back in the courtroom, Timothy sat nervously, whispering frantically to Mrs. Chen, "What's happening? Does she really know my uncle? Is that good or bad?" Mrs. Chen shook her head, looking just as confused. "I have no idea. I've never seen Judge Hayes act like this before." When Judge Hayes returned, her face was composed once more, but something in her eyes had changed. She held a faded photograph in her hand. "Mr. Walker," she said, "was your uncle born in 1977? Timothy nodded. "Yes, ma'am. He just turned 48 last month." "And did he attend Westridge Community College before transferring to State University?" Another nod, more vigorous this time. "That's right. He's got his diploma on his wall. He's real proud of it." Judge Hayes held up the photograph so Timothy could see it. "Is this him? Third from the left in the back row?" Timothy stood up to see better, his eyes widening. "That's him. That's Uncle Leon. He looks so young." He squinted at the picture. "Wait, is that you next to him?" Judge Hayes nodded slowly. 30 years ago, I was a law student volunteering at Camp Horizon. Your uncle was one of my first students. I spent that whole summer trying to convince him that his life could be more than his mistakes. Her voice grew soft with memory. He was brilliant, especially with science and math. All he needed was someone to notice. She looked back at Timothy, seeing shadows of Leon in his face. Your uncle once told me that if someone ever gave him a chance, he'd spend his life giving chances to others. She paused. It sounds like he kept that promise. Timothy nodded, tears welling in his eyes. He's the reason I loved science before everything got so hard. He always tells us kids that it's never too late to change your path. Judge Hayes cleared her throat and set the photograph down on her bench. I need to make a phone call, she announced, surprising everyone in the courtroom. We'll take another 15-minute recess. As she left the bench for the second time that day, whispers erupted throughout the room. The prosecutor leaned over to his assistant, clearly confused. Timothy's mother, who had been sitting quietly in the back row, moved forward to squeeze her son's shoulder. "What's happening?" she whispered. Timothy shook his head. "I don't know, Mom, but I think it might be good." In her chambers, Judge Hayes picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd just looked up in the county directory. Her heart beat a little faster as she waited through 3 rings. "Westside Community Center, this is Leon." The voice was deeper than she remembered, but with the same warmth that had made him such a natural mentor to younger kids at camp. "Leon," she said, "this is Eleanor Hayes. Judge Eleanor Hayes now, actually." The silence on the other end lasted so long she thought they might have been disconnected. "Eleanor?" he finally said, his voice filled with disbelief. "From Camp Horizon?" The law student who used to sneak in extra desserts for the kids who finished their reading. She laughed, a sound rarely heard within the courthouse walls. "That's me. Though it's been a long time since I smuggled pudding cups." "Well, I'll be," Leon said, wonder in his voice. "What in the world?" "Wait." His tone changed suddenly. "Is this about my nephew, Timothy?" "It is," she confirmed. "He's in my courtroom right now." Leon's sigh carried through the phone. "I was afraid this might happen someday. He's a good kid, Eleanor. He really is. His mom, my sister, she's been struggling since her husband went away. Timothy's been trying to help any way he can." "He mentioned you spoke at his school," Judge Hayes said. "About Camp Horizon." "I did," Liam replied. "I tell those kids my story whenever I can. How I was headed for trouble until I met this stubborn law student who wouldn't give up on me." His voice softened. "I tell them about you, Eleanor. About how one person can change your whole life if they care enough." Judge Hayes felt a lump in her throat. "Leon, I've been thinking. Breaking and entering is serious, but Timothy doesn't have any prior record. And I'm wondering if there might be a better option than detention." When she returned to the courtroom, Judge Hayes's face was different. Gone was the stern mask she usually wore. Instead, she looked almost hopeful. "Mr. Walker," she addressed Timothy directly. "I've just had a very interesting conversation with your uncle." Timothy sat up straighter. The prosecutor frowned, clearly sensing his carefully constructed case slipping away. "Breaking and entering is a serious offense," Judge Hayes continued, "and there must be consequences for your actions." Timothy nodded, his shoulders slumping again. "However," she said, "I believe there are more effective consequences than detention at Greenwood." She looked down at her notes, then back at Timothy. "Instead, I'm proposing an alternative sentence. First, you will enter a 6-month intensive mentorship program at the Westside Community Center under the supervision of Leon Williams." Timothy's eyes widened. "Second, you will maintain perfect attendance at school with weekly progress reports from each of your teachers." The prosecutor started to stand. "Your Honor, with all due respect." Judge Hayes held up her hand. "Mr. Porter, I've made my decision." She turned back to Timothy. "Third, you will complete 200 hours of community service, helping to repair the damage at Wilson's Electronics and assisting with other community projects." She leaned forward. "And finally, you will report to this court once a month so I can personally review your progress." The courtroom was silent as everyone processed this unexpected turn. "Mr. Walker," Judge Hayes said, her voice both firm and kind, "breaking the law is never acceptable. but I've seen firsthand that people can change when given the right opportunities and support. 30 years ago, I witnessed your uncle transform his life. Now it's your turn." She looked at Timothy's mother, who had tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Walker, are you willing to support your son through this program?" "Yes, ma'am," she said without hesitation. "Absolutely." Judge Hayes nodded, then looked back at Timothy. "Well, Mr. Walker, are you prepared to work harder than you've ever worked in your life to earn this second chance?" Timothy stood up straight, taller than he'd appeared all day. "Yes, Your Honor. I promise I won't let you down." For the first time in years, Judge Hayes felt the weight of her robe lighten just a bit. "Then let's get started. 6 months can change a life." No one knew this better than Timothy Walker. On a bright spring morning, almost exactly 1 year after that fateful day in Judge Hayes' courtroom, Timothy adjusted his tie in the mirror. It wasn't borrowed this time. His mother had saved up to buy it for him, along with a proper button-down shirt and dress pants that actually fit. "You look so handsome," his mother said, appearing in the doorway of their small bathroom. She looked better too, less tired. The lines around her eyes were from smiling now, not just from worry. "Thanks, Mom," Timothy said, smoothing down his collar one last time. "You think Uncle Leon will be there already?" She nodded. "Probably been there an hour, knowing him. That man's never been late to anything in his life." The ride to the courthouse felt different this time. No handcuffs, no police car. Just Timothy and his mother on the bus, watching the city roll by outside the windows. Everything looked brighter somehow, even the parts of town that hadn't changed at all. The courtroom was the same wooden benches, same flag in the corner, same smell of furniture polish and old books. But Timothy was different. He walked in with his head high, his shoulders straight. He wasn't afraid this time. Several familiar faces were already waiting. Mr. Wilson from the electronics store, who had let Timothy work off part of his community service hours repairing computers in the back room, gave him a friendly nod. Mrs. Rodriguez from the senior center was there too, elegant in her flowered dress, beaming at him like a proud grandmother. And then there was Uncle Leon, deep in conversation with Judge Hayes beside her bench. They both looked up when Timothy entered, their faces breaking into matching smiles. "There he is," Uncle Leon said, clapping a hand on Timothy's shoulder. "The man of the hour." Judge Hayes studied him with approving eyes. "You look well, Mr. Walker." "Thank you, Your Honor," Timothy replied, and meant it. When everyone was seated, Judge Hayes called the court to order. This wasn't a regular hearing. It had been scheduled specially just for today. Almost 1 year ago, Judge Hayes began, Timothy Walker stood in this courtroom facing serious charges. Today, he returns under very different circumstances. She looked down at the folder in front of her, which contained all the reports from the past year. Mr. Walker has not only completed his community service hours, all 200 of them, but has volunteered an additional 50 hours at the Westside Senior Center, teaching computer skills to residents. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically from her seat. "His school attendance has been perfect," Judge Hayes continued. "His grades have improved significantly, particularly in science and mathematics. And according to his mentor," she glanced at Leon with a smile, "he has shown remarkable dedication to turning his life around." She closed the folder and looked directly at Timothy. "Would you like to say a few words, Mr. Walker?" Timothy stood, feeling the weight of all eyes on him. A year ago, this would have terrified him. Now he took a deep breath and began. "Last year, I made a terrible mistake," he said. "I broke the law, and I was ready to accept whatever punishment came my way. Instead, I was given something I didn't even know to ask for, a second chance." He looked at his uncle, then at Judge Hayes. "Through the mentorship program, I've learned more than just how to stay out of trouble. I've learned how to fix things instead of breaking them. I've learned that helping others actually helps me too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Yesterday, I got this in the mail. It's an acceptance letter to the summer science program at State University. Uncle Leon helped me apply. It's for high school students interested in computer engineering." A ripple of applause went through the small crowd. Timothy's mother wiped tears from her eyes. "I never thought I'd be the kind of kid who gets accepted to programs like that," Timothy said. "But Uncle Leon keeps telling me I'm exactly that kind of kid. and for the first time in my life, I'm starting to believe him." Judge Hayes nodded, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The law exists to protect our community, Mr. Walker. But sometimes the best way to do that isn't through punishment alone." She picked up her gavel. "It gives me great pleasure to officially close this case and clear your record as agreed upon completion of the alternative sentencing program." The sound of the gavel hitting the wooden block echoed through the courtroom. But this time, it didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like a beginning. As Timothy left the courthouse that day, the sun warm on his face, he felt lighter than he had in years. He carried neither handcuffs nor the burden of a criminal record, but instead clutched his acceptance letter and the knowledge that two simple words, Camp Horizon, had changed not just his life, but had reminded a judge that behind every case was a human being capable of transformation.